of his whole church, and that same spiritual authority has always resided in the popes or bishops of Rome as being the successors of St. Peter. Consequently, to be true followers of Christ, all Christians, both among the clergy and laity, must be in communion with the See of Rome, where Peter rules in the person of his successor, end quote. Now let us see if we can explain what some of that means. First, the Roman Catholic Church claims that Peter is placed in a position of primacy by the Lord Jesus himself. This primacy is one of honor, jurisdiction, and rulership. Number two, this primacy given to Peter is presented according to dogmatic teachings of the Church of Rome in Matthew 16, verses 18 through 19, and in John 21, verses 15 through 17. According to Roman teaching, Peter is the rock of Matthew 16, that Christ, in conferring a primacy on Peter, intends this to be understood to apply to Peter's successors as well, and that hence Christ is in this passage instituting the office of the Pope for the Christian church. Rome further teaches that when Christ spoke to Peter and said, "Feed my sheep," he was, by so doing, setting Peter apart as the pastor of all Christians in a way different from all the other apostles. Thirdly, Peter is said to have been the bishop of Rome in the Roman position. And number four, because of this, his supposed primacy is passed on to his successors, the bishops of Rome. And finally, this viewpoint has supposedly been the ancient and constant faith of the Christian church. Supposedly the church has always believed this to be true. Anyone who would express a different perspective is holding to perverse opinions and are, in fact, anathema. Therefore, I believe that it is incumbent upon the defender of Roman Catholic teaching to demonstrate the following. Number one, Jesus is without question speaking to Peter in Matthew 16, and is in so doing identifying him as the rock upon which the church is built. Number two, that the words the Lord Jesus speaks establish Peter as the prince of the apostles, the very first pope, the head of the Christian church. Number three, that these words of Jesus necessarily indicate the creation of an office of pope, replete with successors and associated powers. And number four, finally, that the Christian church has always held this to be her constant and unchanging faith. We must note that my opponent cannot merely demonstrate that the Roman position is probably true, or that it is likely to be true, but that it is true beyond question. Rome claims absolute authority in spiritual matters over all believers in Jesus Christ. She claims infallible teaching authority. The papacy is not an issue upon which one can be neutral. Pope Boniface made this quite clear in the papal bull Unum Sanctum, promulgated November 18, 1302, quote, "Consequently, we declare, state, define, and pronounce that it is altogether necessary to salvation for every human creature to be subject to the Roman pontiff," end quote. Now, given the large amount of information that must be examined on this very important issue, we have divided the topic up into two debates, limiting ourselves this evening to the New Testament evidence regarding the Roman Catholic teaching about Peter and the papacy. Now, we first note that the position that the papacy was in fact founded directly by Jesus Christ, in the sense that it was functioning from the days of Peter onward, is not held by all who call themselves Roman Catholics today. While this is certainly the position that has been held historically by Rome, modern apologists have realized that there are deep problems with this perspective. Hence, we recognize that there are Roman Catholics who would not assert that we can find the papacy functioning in the New Testament, for, as John Henry Cardinal Newman said in his book, An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, quote, "While apostles were on earth, there was the display neither of bishop nor pope. Their power had no prominence as being exercised by apostles. In course of time, first the power of the bishop displayed itself, and then the power of the pope," end quote. Secondly, before addressing the few passages adduced by defenders of the papacy, specifically where Jesus supposedly gives this authority to Peter, we must step back and ask the first and most necessary question. Does the New Testament as a whole lead us to believe that Peter was considered the head of the church? Was Peter viewed as the vicar of Christ on earth? Did Christians think of him as the Holy Father? Did the other apostles recognize Peter as their head and leader? Do they direct people to obedience to Peter as the Pope? Does the New Testament lead us to believe that there was an office of Pope to which all Christians looked for guidance and upon which the church's unity itself was founded? And do we find in the words, actions, and writings of Peter himself evidence that he interpreted Jesus' words at Matthew 16, verses 18 through 19, in the way that modern Roman Catholics do? Well, we begin our New Testament survey by recognizing those truths that are not in dispute. Peter's name is prominent in the gospel accounts. He is clearly the leading disciple. His name occurs more often than any other and is almost always first in the listing, which may simply reflect that he was one of the oldest apostles, maybe the oldest, we don't know. He is impetuous, and he is often the first person to open his mouth, sometimes with God's blessing and sometimes to his detriment. For example, immediately after receiving the revelation from the Father concerning the identity of Jesus Christ in Matthew 16, Peter demonstrates his great fallibility by standing in the way of God's very plan of salvation through the atoning death of Jesus Christ. For when the Lord Jesus begins to speak to his disciples concerning his coming death, Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke the Lord. Jesus' response to Peter shows that Peter was not thinking through his statements before making them. This same thing happens on the Mount of Transfiguration. Luke records for us in the 9th chapter of his gospel that Peter again spoke up in the presence of the glory of God and of Moses and Elijah and said, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 for you, one for Moses and one for Elijah." Luke is kind to report for us at this point, quote, "He did not know what he was saying," end quote. If speaking up in the presence of Moses, Elijah, the transfigured Christ, and the glory of the Father, without knowing what you are saying is not indicative of impetuosity, I don't know what is. And so no one disputes that Peter takes a prominent role in the gospel accounts. However, to leap from prominence to primacy is wholly unwarranted on 2 very important accounts. First, the Gospels themselves deny that any of the apostles were in a position of primacy. And secondly, the rest of the New Testament shows that Peter did not actually end up taking any supposed position of primacy. Now, in support of the first point, I call our attention to Luke chapter 22, verses 24 through 30. In this passage, we are told that even as the disciple band walked toward the Garden of Gethsemane on the night of Christ's betrayal, the disciples got into an argument about who among them would be considered the greatest. One might note in passing that this comes right on the heels of the establishment of the Lord's Supper. Might the argument have arisen because John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, had been leaning on the Lord's breast immediately prior to this? Indeed, if the course of history had been different, and political and geographical factors had turned out to favor a church established by the Apostle John, rather than one claiming Peter as its founder, we might this evening be debating if the fact that only John is described as a disciple whom Jesus loved does not, in fact, establish Johannine primacy rather than Petrine primacy. Be that as it may, it does not seem then, in the light of the recurring arguments about who would be the greatest, that the disciples understood the words of Matthew 16 to establish Peter as the foundation of the church, the first pope, the vicar of Christ on earth, for if that were really Christ